In the years following the Second World War, a new kind of conflict began to take shape. Not one of trenches or front lines, but of tension, distance, and unimaginable consequence. This was the beginning of the Cold War. And in Britain, a bold vision emerged to create an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything before it. An aircraft not just of war, but of deterrence. From the drawing offices of A.V. Rowe at Woodford in Cheshire came a shape unlike anything the world had seen. A great delta wing, clean, sweeping, almost silent in its purpose. This was the Avro Vulcan. First flown in 1952, the Vulcan represented a leap into the unknown. Pilots spoke of its power, engineers of its complexity, and observers of its almost otherworldly presence in the sky. It was not simply an aircraft, it was a statement. By 1956, the Vulcan had entered operational service with the Royal Air Force. Painted in anti-flash white, designed to reflect the blinding light of nuclear detonation, it stood ready as part of Britain's strategic V-force. Alongside the Victor and the Valiant, the Vulcan formed a triad of airborne deterrence. Their mission was simple in design, yet profound in consequence. To remain ready, always. To respond, instantly. And ultimately, to ensure that they would never need to be used. Throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Vulcan crews lived in a state of constant readiness. Aircraft stood armed and fueled. Crews waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. This was the quick reaction alert, a silent vigil against a war that must never begin. At the heart of this operation were not just the aircraft, but the people. Pilots, navigators, air electronics officers, and the engineers on the ground. Among them were young men, some barely out of their teens, learning to master one of the most complex machines ever built. It was here that individuals like Joe Raimondo would begin their journey. At just 18 years old, he entered a world of discipline, precision, and responsibility. As an engineering officer working with the Operational Conversion Unit, his role was not simply maintenance, it was preparation. Preparing aircraft for flight and crews for the unforgiving demands of operational service. Every system had to function flawlessly. Every briefing had to be exact. Every decision carried weight. Because in the world of the Vulcan, there was no margin for error. By the early 1960s, the Vulcan had evolved. The B-2 variant introduced greater power, enhanced range, and the ability to carry the Blue Steel standoff missile. But the world was changing. Surface-to-air missile systems were becoming more advanced. Radar networks more sophisticated. The skies were no longer safe. And so, the Vulcan adapted. It descended. From the stratosphere to the terrain below, flying low and fast, using the contours of the land as cover. It was a new way of operating, more demanding, more dangerous, and far less forgiving. For the crews and engineers, this change would redefine everything. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joe Raimondo. Joe joined the Royal Air Force in 1969 and served as an engineer officer within the Operational Conversion Unit during a defining period of Cold War aviation. Working with both the Canberra and later the Avro Vulcan, he played a vital role in maintaining operational readiness at UK RAF bases, including RAF Scampton. During the final years of Vulcan operations, Joe was part of the team ensuring these iconic aircraft remained mission-ready at all times. As an engineer officer at RAF Scampton, he carried the responsibility of readiness, reliability, and trust, supporting both aircraft and aircrew at a pivotal moment in history. Today, we hear his stories, from the flight line to the final chapter of the V4
To the Avro Heritage Museum. This is a conversation with Joe Raimondo, who was an engineer officer with the RAF, and for the last 2 years of the Vulcan deployment, 79 to 81, Joe was based at is it
RAF Scampton.
RAF Scampton, yeah, and helped manage the programme after a full career in the RAF. So, well, let's tell you a few stories. The story we're going to tell you is about a training sortie on the Vulcan that was in Scampton that came down with too heavy a landing, and one of the main wheels had a problem, as Joe will now describe, and that's the picture that we have on the screen. So, Joe, can you just explain what we're looking at?
I mean, I think this, you get a few incidents, especially when you're flying students on an operational conversion unit. But this, to me, has always remained the most memorable one, and I'll explain why. This is the main one leg on the Vulcan, and as you can see, it's got 8 covers, wheels, tyres, and it's got the main leg, and then it's got the strut, the shock absorber. Now what happened is, coming into land, the students dropped the aircraft into the undershoot before the runway, bounced off and then bounced back onto the runway. Fortunately, the chief instructor decided to stop the flight at that point and stop the aircraft right at the end of the runway and called for somebody to go and have a look. When I went out there in the Land Rover with 2 of my chief technicians, and as we got to the aircraft, we realised that in fact there was a problem. The aircraft, what had happened is when it actually hit probably the ground on the second landing, sheared the tube that was holding the shock absorber onto the bogie. It then bounced up again, and luckily for them, it landed on the rear axle, because if it hadn't, the whole undercarriage would have collapsed. But in the meantime, 5, if I remember correctly, of the tyres had blown, so they were flat. And the whole weight of the aircraft on one side was resting on 3 remaining tyres. Now, to deal with a problem like that, you get jacks out, jack the aircraft, change the leg, which basically you're talking about jacks weighing tons, lifting an aircraft out in the middle of the airfield at the end of the runway, which would have blacked one of the 2 nuclear airfields that we had in the UK, probably for days if not weeks. So took the decision to get the tractor, hitch it up, and we started gently towing the aircraft away. By now we had disembarked the crew. And literally we walked it down the taxiway and towards the hangars, and we walked alongside it, keeping an eye on the tyres that were remaining to make sure they were okay. OC Engineering Wing actually came to see what happened, and I thought I would intercept him and advise him that we were towing the aircraft to the hangar, and I would brief him once we got there and parked the aircraft. So he happily went away, and we carried on. We were lucky, we were able to get the aircraft all the way back to the hangar, park it in the hangar without incident, and then we could go ahead with jacking it out, dropping the leg, doing all the checks, doing all the repairs and changes that we had to do, and save blacking the airfield for whatever time it would have been blacked otherwise. But if that oleo hadn't landed on the axle, I'd hate to think what the result could have been. So this is the incident that we actually got away from a major accident.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. I think everybody will find that extremely interesting. In this clip, we'd like to explain a little, or Joe will explain a little, about the de-icing of the Vulcan wings, which was actually a particularly difficult operation given the size of the delta wing. Joe?
Well, with a normal aircraft, with a normal wing, you have a short cord so that you could actually have a razor in front of behind the wing, and you could reach directly onto the wing and actually de-ice the fluid, and you could even brush it. But of course the Vulcan cord is so deep that you couldn't from the front or the rear reach the middle section particularly. So the only way you could actually de-ice it on a cold icy morning was to have people actually get onto the wing in boots, but they couldn't wear studded boots because that wouldn't do much for the skin of the plane. So they were in a very slippy environment, and literally they've been known regularly to slide. So you had to have somebody down in front of the wing with a cord, with a rope going up, which would be tied around the waist of the guy de-icing the wing, so that every time they slid, they could only go so far and then stop, because it's a long way down off the trailing edge of a Vulcan wing to the ground.
Thank you. In this section, we'd like to talk about the red and green engineering control systems that were operational with the OCU, and Joel will explain how that worked and how critical it was to the operations of the aircraft.
Now this applies to all aircraft within the RAF and presumably still goes on today. So it's not specific just to the Vulcan. But sometimes you have a defect that either it's going to take a long time to actually get to it or to get a spare, but which doesn't really impact the safety of the aircraft in flight. Now, hence we got red line and green line entries. Red line entries, if there is a defect that affects what the pilot sees or what the pilot feels or the pilot should definitely know, then that is a red line, so that the pilot will go look at it and just check that he's also happy with what it is and that he knows what he needs to do. Green line is something that doesn't affect the flight of the aircraft, it doesn't affect the operation of it. So the pilot is not going to see anything other than the green line helps him know of other defects that the aircraft is carrying. The aircraft always carries some defects, because otherwise they would never fly. But the question was, what was safe and what was unsafe? My principle was very simple. If I red-lined or green-lined any defect, it would only be on an aircraft that I would be very happy to actually fly in, if necessary, until that is cleared.
Thank you, Joe. I hope that gives you some insights into operating the fleet of Vulcans with the V-Force. Thank you.
Malta, October 1975. On the 14th of October 1975, Avro Vulcan B2 XM645 approached RAF Lucca to land. What followed would unfold in seconds, but would be remembered for generations. A heavy landing, undercarriage damage, a rupture within the wing, fuel escaping. And then, fire. The aircraft lifted again, but it could not be saved. The pilots ejected. Behind them, 5 crew remained. Moments later, over the town of Jabar, the Vulcan came down. 5 aircrew lost their lives. A civilian life was also lost on the ground. Many others were injured. The investigation later concluded the accident had been avoidable. But beyond the findings, there remained something deeper. A lasting awareness that every flight carried risk. For engineers, for crews, for everyone involved, there could be no compromise. Every detail mattered. Every decision mattered. Because when something went wrong, the consequences were final. In 1982, the Vulcan returned. From Ascension Island, it would undertake one of the longest bombing missions in history. A chain of aircraft refueling each other to extend the reach of a single bomber. Across thousands of miles, over open ocean, through darkness, until the target appeared. Port Stanley. The bombs fell, a single crater in the runway, but a message far greater. The Vulcan had returned. In 1984, the Vulcan was withdrawn from service. It had never fulfilled its original purpose, and in that, it had succeeded. Because its role was not to wage war, but to prevent it. Today, the Vulcan remains, in museums, in memory, and in the voices of those who served. Voices like Joe Raimondo. Not history as record, but history as lived experience. Because some aircraft do more than fly. They define an era.